Welcome in-studio audience. Thanks for showing up to the MiiR flagship store in Seattle. We're so glad you guys are here. And online, thanks for tuning in. And a couple things. Last night we had an amazing showing of Pharaoh's Part 2, and we had to have 2 showings because there were so many people out the door. It was nuts, but we had a great time. The slideshow was fantastic. If you guys aren't doing anything, I would recommend heading to Portland tonight and catching their show down there, which is at Keen's headquarters. So yeah, we had a great time last night. We're excited to sit down with Chris today, have more Q&A, find out how he got to where he is today, and talk a lot about creativity and business and passion and cold weather and sitting in frigid waters.
All things fun.
All things fun. Before we get started, I just want to thank Glazer's Camera for helping make the show possible. They're one of the premier independent camera shops that still exists, and they're fantastic people. So if you guys, a lot of creative people out there, if you guys need gear, check out Glazer's. They're fantastic. So the other thing that we usually do is, can I get you a drink?
Yeah, I'd love
What
one.
would you like?
Chai.
Almond milk. Almond milk chai. Can we get an almond milk chai for Chris, and then I will do a cortado for me, please. You guys are awesome. We do, at the MiiR flagship store, we have 28 taps, full espresso bar, in addition to all of our products. So if you guys stop in Seattle, we'd love to have you, host you in our store. So yeah, without further ado, you're here.
I'm here.
I love it.
I love this. I love this city. Actually,
It's
like
you
one
know,
of my
yesterday
favorites.
was fantastic. It
Yeah,
was
it was
sunny.
great.
It was clear.
I was expecting more of this, what it's like right now, which is kind of gloomy and a little rainy.
Yeah.
But yesterday was pretty amazing, especially for all the people standing outside, not in the rain. That was awesome. I felt
the
really
weather worked out great because there were literally people down the sidewalk and there was no rain. But you're used to bad weather.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of like you end up. I guess for me, it's like I'm never really in bad weather for that long. It's always like you're in these 2 to 3 week, maybe a month long, just like period of just heinous, hellacious, weather, and then I'm back home, and it's like I'm kind of like
sunny,
sunny like Central California, and so it's just a funny thing to kind of thrust yourself in between those two environments, and yeah, it's brutal. It's kind of brutal to say the least.
So I think one of the things, how did we get, so like before we get into your story, people might be like, Chris, how does MiiR, like how did this all come to fruition? Some of it was Jill, some of it was, do you know? I mean.
Well, I think I've always looking to, I think for me, like I talked about this last night, I think I've done over the course of like a couple of years, we've premiered a lot of films and done a lot of slideshows and a lot of events, and that's always been, I've always really advocated that. I love that idea of like doing real life, interaction, real life, human FaceTime, not faced. I think it's just really important, and I reached out to MiiR, about, hey, would you guys want to, potentially partner on a project, on a one-off thing, and given this beautiful space, it just made so much sense. And so that to me is always like a really important thing, is find people who share that same vision and want to bring people together. And obviously this is a community space, and we're always kind of looking for opportunities to bring communities together. So this is just, it kind of made perfect sense, And the crazy thing is, like, I was super skeptical about coming to Seattle, only because I love the city, but I have a lot of friends in San Francisco. Thank you so much, man.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I have a lot of friends in San Francisco, and I have a lot of friends in Portland, but like, coming to a city where I don't know as many people, and you're always kind of like, oh, is this, going to be of interest, so I was really humbled. There's so many people here, and it was a really awesome event. I think just it kind of refreshes my own perspective that this is like needed in the community, and it's something people want to do, which is rad.
Well, I think it speaks volumes to who you are and the followers that you have that really want to interact and actually have that physical presence where they come in and see you, they see the story, they see the slideshow. It's not just, hey, I'm gonna like double tap your photo because it's beautiful. It's like, that's part of it, but then there's that interactive part.
I mean, the reality is, like, it's great being able to reach, thousands of people, but if I would rather, have intimate conversation with like, 100 folks, at a time. And I think that those interactions, just, I think they go so much longer. They last so much more. And it's just like, that's the dream. Is like, it's always funny, people reach out like, oh, where's your favorite place to go? Oh, I'm traveling to Iceland, I'd love to get some information. Like, that's the coolest thing to be able to give people, is like advice on like how to travel somewhere, or like how to have a great experience. And I've, maybe I've single-handedly helped promote some of these places that I've been, and that would be awesome, because that's ultimately my goal, would be to share those experiences and hope that they would be willing to go see them for themselves. And I think that that's like a really fulfilling thing, is to know that you've inspired new ways of thinking or new experiences for somebody who might not have had that if they hadn't maybe seen this or hadn't maybe thought that the Faroes or Russia or Kamchatka was like a viable place they could actually go to. Because I'm just a normal human being. Like I have no superpowers. I am not super talented in any way. Like in terms of traveling. Well, I mean, but it's like you always look at these places and you're like, oh man, professional athletes are going there, or this or that. Or these are like places for like, you go if you're super wealthy. I'm like, I did this on a shoestring budget. These things are possible. This type of travel is totally viable for anyone. I think that's what I mean to say is like that. It's about going to approachable locations and just about taking kind of steps to make it like your own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys have the film. If you go to so before we jump in, we'll close this too. And just where can people find you on the Twitters, the Grams?
I mean,
the film,
I'm out there.
Yeah,
I'm out there. So I try to be pretty active in social media, just in terms of having it be a way of sharing experiences and storytelling. With a lot of times when I'm on a project or on a trip, I love to share like on the road. I think that's a really cool thing to do. One thing about social media, I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot because it's such a topic that people like to chat about, is that I think it's important to realize like its place, and one of its places is to kind of break down those barriers of like where of work and where people are in their lives. And so I think it's really cool to be able to invite people along for an experience. You're somewhere in the world, you're doing something, like sharing what that is like while you're there. I think people really rally behind that, and I just think it's a really cool experience. As for the film, it's available on iTunes. Okay. You can download it, as well as like we've done like 4 or 5 other films and projects, and the Aleutian Islands and Russia and some other really wild, crazy adventures.
So all those are on iTunes, so you can follow. So you can
on iTunes, absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah, look up my website or Ben Weiland's, and you can find all that stuff.
So chrisburkard.com.
Yeah.
You can check it out there. I think one thing that's interesting is you have an interesting life, but the last 5 have been pretty crazy, right?
Last 5 lives,
Last 5.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of been this trajectory, right? So I think a lot of people are probably interested, how do you go from, like, tell us how you go from, like, really photographer. Good. Is it good?
Yeah, it's so good. I don't quite understand, like, I'm not like a coffee shop connoisseur, so I don't quite understand the handle thing, but I get it. It's kind of...
It's we're trying to be, it's the feng shui, right? Like, trying to get rid of handles.
I feel like it's about to pour in my lap, but I love it other than that.
We do have a handle mug,
No, it's good. It's good.
So describe to us where does your passion, I think what's curious is like, how did you get into cold weather photography? How did you have that passion? And then kind of, we'll get more into like, how did you kind of have this following you have now?
That's a good question. And I think it's best described like this. It's kind of hard to like just like take that little segment and be like, without telling kind of the whole story. But essentially, like I grew up in Central California, in a little town called Pismo Beach area, and I didn't have a passport when I growing up. I didn't travel whatsoever growing up. It was like that type of experience where I yearned for those things and I wanted those things. I wanted to get out of this small town. I wanted to, form my own perspectives of these places that I would see on the news and hear about from my parents and yada, yada, yada. And I was so eager to do that, but I just didn't come from, those opportunities weren't really available for me. So I knew that I had to make them available to me. And I had this job at this magazine store. It's funny how this story is kind of like spread around, but I got this job at this magazine store. It's still there. It's called Esquire News. And I thought in some way, I think I was like 18, 19, I thought that like if I got this job and I was like surrounded by like the pages of National Geographic and all these things, I would somehow get closer to being there.
Yeah.
But all it did was like it drove me like loony. Like it was like I worked there for like 2 weeks and I like quit. I was like, this is the worst thing ever, because I would just spend my days flipping through the glossy pages, and dreaming about being there. And I realized I was like, I need to give this 100% of everything I have, like photography. And I knew that it wasn't so much that I like went to photography because I was like, I want to pick up a camera and do this and that. I saw it as a means of travel. I saw it as a way to like accelerate that experience of trying to get to some of these places. And so I first picked it up to, I didn't pick it up to change the world. I picked it up to change me. And first and foremost. And so I hope this is all making sense. But I basically told I'm like, I'm going to give this 5 years. I'm going to give photography 5 years. And if I'm laying down in the dirt somewhere, fine. If I have a career, I'm thriving, awesome. And that's exactly what I did. And the next day I was right back in Pismo Beach, except for I was out on the pier and I was trying to make money any way I could, and I was basically just taking pictures of like surfers out in the lineup and then running up to them afterwards and like trying to sell them some photos on a DVD or something. Or I was like shooting like, senior portraits and weddings, anything I could. Like that was the whole thing, is that I think people often, and this is like a segue, you'll find I do this a lot, people often are like, they're really interested in like knowing how to get to this point, but they aren't willing to go through all the other things to get there. And so like, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I would say the first couple of years, couple of months, whatever, I was willing to shoot absolutely anything to make a paycheck, and I still am, because like that's like not where my passion lies. It's great to be able to do these things, but I also like, I want to support my family. I want to travel and see the world. And so I think that it's great to be able to combine those two things now, but that's really not how it started. So ultimately, I had this dream of shooting landscapes was actually my first and foremost passion. That was like all I really cared about. But after realizing that I couldn't really learn about these things in college, in school, sorry, my phone's ringing.
That's right.
I couldn't really learn about these things in college and in school. I opted to kind of go to a different method. I wanted to like learn by doing, and I wanted to learn by apprenticeship. And so I did a couple of apprenticeships and some internships, and one of them was with this really amazing landscape photographer that I respected so much, and I loved his work, and just very, very, very like timeless in a lot of ways. And he taught me a lot of things, yet one thing that I realized was that if you wanted to be a landscape photographer, this is like 9 years ago, like you had to be at a different stage of life. You had to have a gallery, or you had to have the equipment or the means or the time to travel and go shoot these images. And like, it wasn't something for like a 19-year-old guy who like it's just a different process. It wasn't feasible for me. And so I kind of like was bummed, because I loved landscape photography. That's what drew me in, like being outdoors and sharing those experiences. And so I came back home after this internship, and I was like, man, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to travel and make this, So I looked at myself and I was like, what do I know intrinsically? Like, what did I grow up doing? I understood surfing. I grew up, at the beach. It's just the community that I was in. Grew up there. So I kind of tried to combine this aspect of shooting these like more pulled back landscape inspired images, but also combining the human element and shooting surfing. So that's really what I tried to bring to that sport. And I started shooting it a lot, and I had the opportunity to start, fast forward, working for a magazine. A couple years later, working for Transworld Surf, and then Surfline, and now Surfer Magazine as a staff photographer. And ultimately what was happening was I was going to these kind of postcard locations. And it was amazing. They were incredible. You're on the beach in Mentawais and Bali and Thailand, and yada, yada, yada. It's awesome. But I was just so fed up with this cookie cutter experience that it wasn't changing me. I got into photography and to travel because I wanted to be changed. I wanted to have my, my mind and perspective kind of ripped open of what I thought. And it was this kind of like shuttled along experience, where you're dealing with, things like petty theft and, like everybody's trying to sell you something, and, bugs everywhere. And it was just this like kind of, I don't know, you go to, these places used to be wild.
Right.
Hawaii, these beaches where there's like these massive resorts, they used to be these wild, crazy, remote places, the beaches of Mexico and stuff like that. And now you go there, and although the brochure might tell you that they are, they're not. And so I realized that I had to look somewhere else. And I wanted to go to places that were wild and left people feeling like, this is something that was impressionable to them. And so I started to seek out the places that were too cold, too remote, and too dangerous to surf and photograph. And ultimately, that's why I started to go to cold places. And I think that what I found when I got there was something that I just, you can't really describe until you go. It was like to be somewhere where there's no footprints on the beach, and that contrast of being in a place like Bali, in Kuta Beach, and there's just thousands of people, and you're like lining up with other photographers shooting something, and then to be in like remote, Norway in the Arctic Circle, there's no one around, the wind's howling, it just, that experience leaves marks on you, sometimes physical, sometimes emotional, that you just don't forget, you know? And I feel like the experiences that I've had going to those places have become so much more visceral because of what you've had to endure. So, sorry for the long form answer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a couple things that I kind of want to tease out, because I think a lot of people who are younger and looking at, you know, career, I want to do X, I want to start my own company, I want to be a photographer, and there is kind of that space between like starting and then getting to where you are, and you know, whether it's success or whatever, what have you, there's a lot of stuff in between where you have to do those kind of other jobs that aren't necessarily glamorous. But what was that conversation like where, or describe it if maybe it didn't happen, I don't know, how were your parents with your like, hey, actually not going to college, I'm going to do this like photography thing?
They were super pissed.
Really?
Yeah, because I was the only person in my family that had the opportunity to go to school, because I did have some scholarships and stuff like that, and I opted not to. And you know, it was really challenging because honestly, like, I don't know, everybody has to find something that drives them. One of my greatest driving forces in my life was the fact that my mom, she had me when she was super young. She had me when she was like 16 and basically gave up a lot of things to have me. And so I knew that one of the things that always drove me was I wanted to like share these places that I would travel with her and go to those places. And so I felt really like I owed her something, and I felt really bad when I opted not to go to school, and it was a really personal decision. But and she's like, well, what if the decision to hire you is between you and this other person, and they have this college degree? Well, yeah, that makes sense, but for the work that I want to do, it's never come up, and that's the thing is I feel like nowadays in this day and age, I have so many friends I went to high school with, and they're not pursuing anything that they did in college. And I'm not here to bash on the collegiate system and all, but I definitely feel like it's worth rethinking sometimes, and it's worth evaluating. I'm all for learning. I'm always for learning. I mean, I'm still constantly learning now, but I feel like there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of different ways to explore that, and in a lot of ways, I feel like I would rather see somebody who like really took the initiative to learn on their own instead of squandering or wasting away their parents' money or their own money going to like 4 years of college just so they had an excuse to party, And I kind of feel like for me it was really fast tracked because I really focused on what I wanted in a career, and I put aside all these other things. I didn't spend those years going through that system, and I feel like it probably would have slowed me down if anything. So,
and in that, like, how did you have the foresight to be like, all right, I'm going to do this for 5 years? Because I think a lot of people are like, I'm going to do this.
I just picked a number.
You just picked a number? I mean, because a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to do this for a couple months, see if it works out, and they're like, oh, the door's closed. It's like, sometimes you got to bust down doors. So like, did you just like choose 5, or you're like, I'm going to stick this out? Because
I think somebody had actually at one point told me that, like, they said the same thing, and I was like, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to do this too. I'm going to try the same thing. So I mean, yeah, it ended up, luckily things ended up working out, but yeah, I'm not gonna lie, there was like extended periods of time where I was like sleeping in my car and eating like, like El Pollo Loco, like burritos for like 35 cents or something like that, or whatever, for like days on end. And I mean, that was, I did an internship at Transworld Surf. I would drive 4 to 5 hours every Monday from my house in San Luis Obispo to Oceanside, sleep in my car for the week, intern every single day, shower at like the beach showers, come back home and learn. And it was an unpaid scenario, so it was just this amazing learning opportunity. And I loved those experiences though, because like I said, like it's another one of those things. When you endure something that makes you struggle, it becomes more meaningful. Because you gave something about that. So I remember those nights being like woken up by the police tapping on my window saying like, you can't sleep here, things like that.
Just resting.
Yeah, I'm just resting. It's good, But so yeah, I feel like from an early age, I started to realize like, wow, like you have to thrust yourself into some hardships in order to make those experiences worth it. And so yeah, it was just kind of a learning opportunity, I guess.
Wow. So you tell your parents, no, I'm not going to college. It's worked out, right? By a lot of measures, it's worked out, right? So how is it now? Have your parents been like, okay, like,
I mean,
stoked, they still like, hey, go back to college?
They're the best. They're my greatest advocates, and yeah, absolutely. I have 2 kids. I know, I see now like the importance, and you want to promote them to do that, but ultimately there came a point where I think that maybe that was a driving force too, to wanting to work really hard and put out, a books or this or that, and be like, hey, like, this is working, like, and nowadays, like, I don't need to, you don't need to be validated in that. And I think that's one of the hardest things, to be honest, like, and this maybe somebody else out there in the crowd can relate this, but as a creative, being validated in your work is probably one of the hardest things you will ever do. Because you're constantly at the mercy of editors, you're constantly at the mercy of creatives telling you what they think is good or what they think is not good, so this is one of the beauties of social media. Nobody's there to validate you because you're doing it yourself. You're the one curating that feed or that page or that content or whatever it is. And nowadays you have these creatives that at no other time before, because of things like YouTube and because of things like, all of these other social platforms, you can put the work out there without anybody else curating it for you. And you can find out from really just peer engagement if it's good or if it's not, you know? And not to say that that is really what makes it good or not, but ultimately you can find that people are responding to that positively. So it's really valuable, to take this to a brand and be like, well, I don't need you to tell me what's gonna work because I deal with these people all the time. You sit behind a desk and you're trying to, tell me what makes sense and how people are going to engage with that. It's like the proof is in the pudding, I guess you could say. And so it's really valuable to look at that. I think it's really unique for brands too. It's awesome.
Totally. Not trying to be everything to everybody and not trying to always please your critics. Because if you have critics, it's probably a good thing because it means that you're actually trying to attract a different crowd, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. Critics are great. I think Yvon Chouinard said this at one point. He's like, if you're not pissing off 50% of people, you're not doing your job. Yeah. And I know that's not easy to hear, but sometimes it's actually like really great.
Yeah, absolutely. We were at a conference earlier this week in South Dakota and keynoted, and he said, similar thing, like, don't appease your critics, like, don't follow them and try to like make them happy, like, follow your true path and make yourself happy through what you're doing.
Right.
It's been cool to see kind of your trajectory going from cookie cutter surf photos of like, oh my gosh, they kind of all look the same, like dudes stoked on a board in the middle of some amazing.
And I think that the beauty, it's a funny thing, like I think people like refer in some ways to me as like a surf photographer because I never wanted to be that and I never really had that desire, and it's really been cool to like, this has been the greatest like joy in my life has been through I had a really awesome thriving career prior to any social media, but I think what really helped me to make a shift from really just shooting like 99% of my assignments being surf related or magazine related or this and that was the validation that I received from social media sharing more landscape work. Because that's what I love. That's all I care about. Yeah. Like I could care less about working with professional athletes and going to these places. I like to go there because those are places that draw me in first and foremost. Yeah. The waves are secondary. Yeah. And so for me now, 90% of my work is really landscape and commercial like projects that, whether I'm shooting, hot Toyota, and it's like we're going somewhere where like the landscape is usually first and foremost. And so for me, it's so cool to celebrate that. And in my work on a bunch of different levels and be able to ultimately come full circle to be like, wow, like now you don't have to be that, older, very established, having galleries, this and that, to be a landscape photographer. You can share this work and sell it online all the time. And that's ultimately like when I sell prints, that's the stuff that sells the most. So it's pretty cool how things have kind of shifted that paradigm in the last just 10 years.
Oh yeah, in the last 5-10 years has dramatically shifted in the online landscape and be able to sell online but yet be comfortable to post on Instagram. Because I remember I have a bunch of friends who are photographers and Instagram comes out and they're like, oh my gosh, Instagram's gonna steal my photos, and there's that whole like hubbub like 3 years ago where like they changed the term and conditions. They're like, oh my gosh, so it's
I have my own thoughts about that, and I'd like to actually talk about that a little bit, but I think well, there's this like, one of the old kind of methods of promoting yourself for photographers is like investing into creating like marketing materials that you can like send to ad agencies, and you can send little promo mailers. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever been into an editor's desk at a magazine, but they basically have this stack of promo mailers on the edge of their desk that they never look at. It's like a picture with their name on it, blank photography, and like a photo, or maybe it's like a little book, or maybe it's a little this, and it's just the most meaningless thing you've ever seen, because you spend this money, you put it on, you send it to them, they look at it once and it's gone, right? And so I think for me, I thought about that pretty early on in my career. I'm like, do I want to do that? Do I want to like invest like $2,000 or whatever it would cost into promo mailers or do this and that? So I said no. I'd rather put I'd rather invest that money into myself, put out some of my best work online, and let that work just go. Not worry about it. Not worry if some person's reposting it or sharing it or stealing it or whatever. And so ultimately, like, if you think like that same amount of money I could have made from selling this work, I'm gonna pay myself to let it be. Right? I don't know if that makes sense. But basically, it was just something where I started noticing that work being shared and on that online platform, digital landscape.
Yeah.
And it really ended up benefiting me way more than any promo mail or any type of marketing scheme could have, you know? And that's really something I really put a lot of value in today, is putting your work out there and letting it go be out there, because some of the best commercial work I've ever done has originated from social media in some way, whether it's my website or whether it's Facebook or whether it's something.
And people contacting you and then contracting you out
yeah,
as well.
Yeah.
So did it start on Facebook? Just like what medium did it start on for that promotion?
Was that?
Which medium did it start for you? Was it Facebook and then Instagram? Like, how was that migration? Right.
Well, my website was first and foremost, and I did a blog. I had a blog, Blogspot.
The old Blogspot.
Like 6 years ago, and then we moved over to like a Tumblr, and then it was like, okay, Facebook, and then it was like, okay, and like I only joined Instagram like 2.5 years ago or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, like I was super late bloomer. Like my wife was like, you should get Facebook. Like I'm like, I hate that site. I'm like, that's like, I don't want to like be on there. That's like for people hooking up and like stuff. And I eventually got it, and then like I think I was in Iceland like literally like 2.5, 3 years ago, and somebody was like, you should get Instagram, and I'm like, why? People just post photos of their food on there or something. and then I was like, is it really have professional application? And ultimately, like, yeah, it did, and it was really cool. It's been cool to see the growth on there, and honestly, like, I've found so many people that inspire me on that app, and that's been a really cool thing. There's dark sides to every sort of social media. I mean, the more you have, the more you basically are disconnected from the world, which is really a huge bummer.
Because you're living in, virtual reality.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, I think it's a matter of just like finding the time of when it makes sense and finding the time when it doesn't, and just kind of balancing that out. It's like ebb and flow and everything, I think.
Totally. So you've had, for you guys who don't follow Chris on Instagram, you should check it out. Handles Chris Burkard, just all one word. 1-point-something million followers in the last 2 years, which is crazy. And I think a lot of it's because those photos are so unique to you in those wild places.
Well, I think
at least from an outsider's perspective.
Well, I think one of the things that happens is like a lot of folks, I came from an editorial background, meaning like one of the internships I did was at Trans World Surf. And one of the greatest values of that internship was learning how the editorial system worked, understanding what the magazine needed, understanding that like when I was submitting photos to the magazine, I wasn't just giving them a batch of like, oh, here's my best stuff. It was like looking at their editorial calendar. And this applies to anything. This applies to any world, of magazines. But like, say, for example, if I was submitting a cold water story in summer when all their advertisers are promoting board shorts, it doesn't make sense, right? So once I tuned in to what they needed, what they wanted, it really made me reevaluate, okay, how am I submitting? Am I submitting just blind submissions that are gonna get shuffled under the doormat because they don't have the time to publish it? Or am I kind of queuing up what I'm gonna submit with their editorial calendar, their advertisers, and everything started to make more sense. And so for me, like, that was everything, being published from day one. And I really learned a ton from that process.
Right.
And I think at the same time, a lot of photographers have kind of born and bred out of social media, and it has really, in some ways, it's been great, but it's also like not been great. When they branch out of that platform, it's not really that great, for them. They still have to realize that just because there is this great follower base and this and that, it's really important to still like learn that you have to take baby steps in these other realms. So for me, I've always been very storytelling driven. Like every time I've done an assignment for the magazine, it's been an assignment, it's been a feature, it's been like I'm trying to come back with text and photos and video potentially to fulfill all of these different buckets, this, the print, like thing, their website, whatever it is. And Ben, who's the cinematographer that I worked with on the Pharaohs and director and helped produce it, super talented guy. He's also a journalist. And so for me, it's a matter of like teaming up with somebody who could help fulfill those things. I'm not really a great writer, but I've always...
But you recognize that as a key piece to do those feature
Right.
pieces, yeah.
So the whole thing is like, I'm thinking from a storytelling perspective. So when I go on Instagram or I go on Facebook, whatever, it's the same thing. I never think of it as like, oh great, here's this one photo with just randomly. It's like, I want to tell a story. Yeah. And I think what people miss out on so much, if there's like one piece of advice I could give you, is like, don't tell me that the mountains are calling and you must go, because like it just makes me want to kill myself. Like that type of regurgitating of other people's ideas is such a it's such a bad use of that platform. Like this is a place where you can have original thought and original ideas, and you can share those things. And I think it's so important to realize that there is a blank space for captions. It's where words go. You can write words down that ideally will share what people, not what people are seeing, but what you felt, what it smelled like, what it tasted like. What is the visceral experience from that moment? You know, and so ultimately, a lot of times as photographers, we kind of forget, like, the photo is showing people what's happening. We don't need to describe that. Totally. They have eyes. You know, we talked about this yesterday. Yeah. But this is a space where you can tell people what the feeling and what the emotion from that experience was like, and that is so valuable. I think that the caption and how you share that story is really undervalued, and something that we need to reevaluate as creatives.
Yeah, and that was something that was really key, is that it sounds so basic, but actually describing in the comment of whether it's on Instagram or Facebook, and that's so much more interesting than like, oh, here's a photo of the mountains. These are the mountains in, you know, such and such place.
I think it's, you know, it can ebb and flow. Like I'll just do like a super simple thing sometimes, where it's like very basic and like very like location, this, that. Sometimes it's a personal story. You don't want to always have these long drawn out things, you know, where it kind of becomes a bummer. But I think it's about a matter of just mixing it up. Like I get bummed when I go through someone's feed and like I'm scrolling down and it's just like, you know, this kind of like quote after quote after quote after quote of somebody else's quote. I'm like, give me, what's your quote? Like, you know, like what's your thought? What's your idea? Like, what did it feel like? You know, I feel like we miss out on that, you know, and same thing in good brand communication. Like people are afraid to piss people off. Yeah,
or like they're not comfortable, or it's uncomfortable. We talked about, you know, being uncomfortable yesterday. You said like go and be uncomfortable, and that you know, from photography to brands, not just producing what's already out there, but looking beyond what's there. Like we do that very much at MiiR, where it's like, let's not just look at what the current landscape is for a hydration bottle and like what everybody's expecting. Let's do something that's different, right? And find that space.
It's just a matter of, you know, challenging old ways of thought. Like that's the whole point. I mean, even with this Pharaohs film, we came out with this film like 6 months prior, but we actually decided not to put it out because they had just had one of their annual whale slaughterings, and we thought it was kind of insensitive for us to put that out during that time. And we knew that we were going to be faced with a lot of kind of backlash from this. Like we're creating a film on a place that people are trying to like boycott. And I'm like, it just makes me so sad that like we would be so ignorant to turn away from cultures because we don't like what one sect of their population is doing. I mean, imagine if people thought about the same thing in the United States. It would be, nobody would ever come here. Yeah. And so I guess I feel like everything I've done, I've wanted in some way to challenge like traditional ways of thinking, and ultimately like I'm okay being you know, called out for things. Like the funniest thing too is like I think people forget that you're like a real human being sometimes on social media. They have this word for people called trolls. It's amazing. And sometimes I just love like picking through the comments and like totally calling somebody out and being like, hey, like, you know, like not agreeing with them, and they usually get shocked because I'm like, you know, like I'm not gonna not engage with you if I don't agree with what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Like, that's just, you know, if we were having a conversation, it'd be the same way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't just be silent and let somebody say something and then like kindly walk away.
And if they were in person, they probably wouldn't say it in the first place because
exactly,
you know,
and
the trolls online can hide behind, you know, whoever.
Yeah, it's such a funny thing, you know. But I think that, you know, learning and just kind of developing how we communicate on those platforms is probably one of like the hardest things we'll struggle with in the next couple, you know, upcoming years.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so. Absolutely. There's a bunch of people tuning in online. Thank you guys. If you've just joined, I'm Brian Pape. I'm the founder of MiiR. We're here with Chris Burkard, an amazing photographer. What would you describe yourself as? I forgot to ask you. Like, I just call you an amazing
human being.
Just a human being. We've got Chris, the human here.
I'm a photographer. I'm a director. I'm an author. I'm a whatever. But all those.
Dad.
Yeah, I'm a dad.
Your husband.
I'm first and foremost, I'm a dad. And those are all pretty heavy titles that I didn't really think I would ever be able to have, but I'm grateful to to have them and to share in those different ways. So.
Absolutely. And then people in studio as well are in the flagship. Where if something inspires you that Chris says, use the hashtag MiiR Live. We'll be giving away books, some bottles for people that are either retweeting or sharing this online.
Can I ask this screen?
Let's go to the.
There's a kid, Daniel Thor. He's 18 years old from Iceland. I would like to become an adventure photographer, but don't know where to start. Do you have any tips to get me out there?
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, tips to get you out there. I mean, ultimately, like, you kind of answered it in that one, Daniel. Like, you're an adventure photographer, you want to get out there. Well, like, go have adventures. Like, that's kind of the goal, I think. And don't let the camera system or whatever your storytelling method, whether it's writing, whether it's videography, don't let that slow you down, right? You're better off going out and having an adventure with something like this than you are with a big camera if it means it's going to hinder that experience, right? So start small. I think that's one of the most important things. Like, you want to become an adventure photographer, don't go out and buy this massive camera system that you're going to be lugging around. Like, go grab something tiny, plan an adventure, like, see it through. Like, okay, my goal is to drive from here to like the other town. What am I going to see? And like start small and then go big. I feel like that's one of the key things is like people kind of lose sight of where to start.
Totally.
And it's all about, like, I have a draft of just ideas. Like, oh, I want to drive the entire coast of Chile from northern Chile to the tip of Tierra del Fuego and explore the desert and all the different climates and do a little piece on how it has all these different things. Like, that's just one of these like harebrained ideas that I'll probably never do, but it would be so cool to. I don't know. Like, I want to go back to the Kuril Islands between Japan and Russia. I Googled or researched this one island and. Just like thinking about how you can do that, and then ultimately thinking about how you can share it.
Right.
I guess for some people maybe they want to shoot that work, they just want to keep it to themselves. But I place so much value on being able to share your work. It's like I feel like in a lot of ways, if you're not sharing your work, then what are you doing? How is it?
Right.
How is it helping inspire change or helping others?
Yeah. So on his question, what did you? Because I remember thinking back. So I used to do a lot of videography before I got into business and started MiiR. So I picked up my family's VHS. I mean, we had a canvas bag that like the VCR and the battery like sat in.
Yeah.
That like came out to a camera. Like, that's how you had to film. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And now we have 4K in our pockets, which is nuts. But I mean,
Exactly.
And that's where I started. And then I filmed the wedding, saved up money, and then bought a new camera, saved up money. And so like, what did you start with on your camera? Like, when you look back, 10.
The first camera I had.
Yeah. What was the first camera? Was it film?
The first camera that I ever used was my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, her mom, she had an old Canon film camera. I picked it up, I shot a couple rolls of slide film, I gave it back to her. I was like, I need to buy one of my own. I went to the Goodwill auction and I bought this camera for $65 and it was an Olympus. It never worked, ever. I ran like 3 rolls of film through it, was so excited I got it and they never came out.
Oh.
And that was my first camera and I still have it, it's in my gallery right now. But then other than that,
paperweight.
I was shooting a couple of old Nikons and a couple of like old Canons, and then I ended up shooting digital. Canon 20D was like my first digital camera. But always since then I've shot film alongside that, and I still shoot like a tiny bit of large format when I have the time. And but yeah, it's amazing where things start.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, like, the cameras that I was shooting back then are bigger than the cameras I'm shooting now.
Right.
And it's amazing to see how that process has really made them more minimalistic, which I love.
Yeah, and there's so many tools now. I mean, you can go out and buy a GoPro for $200 and
it's crazy. It's
capture
amazing.
me.
Well,
Yeah.
like there's little, it's kind of great too, because I find there's like no excuse not to create good content.
Yeah, you can capture anything now.
Yeah.
So now that everybody can have access to that, how would there's been this democratization of cameras, technology. How do you, as a photographer, besides going to wild places, like how do you separate yourself from like all the people that like want to be you? For instance.
I don't mind if people want to do what I do. I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
I think that there has to be, to answer that question, it's good to address the fact that, like, I think 10 years ago, I remember when I was starting out and I was really, emailing people for questions. I was emailing like photographers. I was like, oh, I would love to get some advice. I'd love to do this. There was so much, people were not willing to share information. I reached out to some of my favorite photographers ever, and they were just like, there was like zero response or like a very quick response, and it just like, no, I don't have internships. It was just, there was such a different vibe, and I always kind of aimed to be like, I don't want to be like that. I want to be able to be open. And I think what it was like, back in the day, which sounds funny to say. I think things have actually like really changed like dramatically over the last couple of years. And so it used to be kind of this method where you were sought after because you were exclusive, right? And you were like hard to get to and hard to reach, and a lot of like, I think, not to put a title on, maybe like some Nat Geo guys were kind of like that, like hard to reach, very exclusive, doing this and that. And nowadays you're kind of more celebrated if you're accessible and if you're available for people and if you open yourself up to ultimately, do events like this or something like that. So I feel like the landscape has shifted, and I think a big part of that is because like what would happen, it used to kind of be that thing where you would shoot for like 20, 30 years, and then you'd kind of sit on that body of work and sell it or license it over the next like 20, 30 years. But nowadays it's not really like that. You can't just like kind of sit back on your laurels and hope that things. So I guess for me, I'm constantly thinking like, great, if somebody's going to come up and they want to be like me, they're going to challenge me, and they're only going to make me want to work harder. And they're only going, and so that's healthy. That's a healthy thing to have, is people in the same space as you wanting to push you and elevate your work into something else. I think that's like such a unique thing to have available to you. And what you find is that most people want to shoot great photography. Most people don't want to have their own perspective. You can find thousands of people out there that are kind of shooting the same similar work and going to the same similar places, and geez, I mean, we all kind of end up at that place at some point. So I think for me, setting myself apart, it's been more about like telling stories, doing events, trying to create books and content people can digest and actually take in, as well as going to places that I feel like are off the beaten path, and like the Faroes is one of them. I mean, we did one of the first trips and films to the Faroes ever, that hasn't been about whaling or about something else. It was a really cool thing to go there and share a side of their culture that wasn't this like widely broadcasted, barbaric thing. It's like there's also, they're real people. They're like living life and enduring like really some pretty gnarly things. And so for us, it was really cool. And that's been the same thing with Iceland. I've been there 21 times. Like I said, most of the time I'm going to places that nobody's been. And it is, thousands of people go there every day. It's like crazy, but they all stick within this one like 6-hour stretch in the South Coast. And I always tell people like, go to the north. Like you'd be so shocked at what you'll see. Like go to the east, go to the west, like where there's like literally 0 cars and like hot springs right off the road. It's kind of mind blowing to me. And I think most people just aren't willing to put in the time to prepare, to do the research, to go to somewhere new. Right?
And we talked a little bit about lunch. I'd love for you to describe kind of that process where you talk about like there's kind of this challenge right now where there's a lot of creatives, a lot of people want to be ambassadors for brands. They're not sure like, do I get paid retainer? Do I pump out this many photos? But I love the approach that you talked about, and it's what you've been doing. It's what you did with the Faroes and that whole like 3 kind of prong process. Do you want to describe a little bit about that?
I think absolutely. That's a good point. I think for me.
Because that's very different than what everybody else is doing.
I think, it's interesting because I think here's the difference, and it's just like I've said before, like coming from an editorial background, and what that really means is like I grew up with the goal in mind of wanting to get published in magazines, and prior to social media, really like editorial or magazines, that was your best exposure. That was your best opportunity for exposure to brands and to other things like, oh, you're widely published. You're not out there getting published in Outside and Men's Journal because you're making a living off of that. Like those, couple photos of that feature you shoot. You're making a living off of shooting work for commercial clients, but they're seeing your work based in that editorial world. So I think for me, when social media came out and it was here and right in front of me, it was really eye-opening to be like, okay, well, how does this fit in? How does this fit into this whole entire thing? How does this fit into this whole process of like, shooting for magazines and shooting for clients and doing all this stuff? And what I realized was there's this great opportunity to bring this to social media, to brands, to magazines, as kind of a way to pump up the work that you're already doing in a way. And so I guess I've always approached it from this 3-prong process, and what that is really, it's like I go on a trip, like example for the Faroes, or to Alaska, right? Me and Ben did a really awesome trip to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and when we were there, we were sharing photographs while we were there on the limited times that we'd have Wi-Fi, and it was really like, it wasn't like the epic stuff, right? It wasn't like, oh, like here's this awesome photo of like the surfer with the volcano. Like we were we were sharing these photos that were kind of just teasing out the project. And the whole goal is like, it benefits the magazine, it benefits the brands. You know, this is something you can monetize ultimately, right? So we're sharing, for 2 weeks we're there, we're sharing it, cool, so there's all this buzz being created, it's really rad. And then all that goes kind of dark. And then the magazine comes out, the article. So it's usually a linear thing where it's either like a web video or a web blog or a print article. It could be both. So there's the social media element, the web or print element, and the third part of that would be you coming back and doing a physical experience, an art show, a film screening, a slideshow, you're releasing a book, you're releasing a zine, something that basically takes it from being this purely digital experience where you're sitting there scrolling with your thumb to being something where you're opening it up in the page of a magazine, or you're reading it on a website, or you're viewing it on a website, or it's a little more intimate, to being a truly intimate experience where you're actually interacting with human beings on a face-to-face level, and you're telling them what it was like, and you're sharing those stories. Like, that is, I think, how every creative and every brand should be working. Because if this is your only goal, you know, if you're whatever, you know, who knows, the Toyotas of the world, whatever, and like, this is your only goal. It's like, we're just gonna do this social thing, we wanna hire you to do this, that's great, but like, it doesn't inspire any connectivity to the brand or to the magazine or to the place or to anything. It's like, it needs to kind of evolve through this process. And what I think is really cool is being able to kind of follow it, because the beauty of social media is it can kind of carry through this whole entire experience. Social media is the one thing that you can promote the web article or the blog or the print magazine with social media. You can also promote the experience with social media. And so the social media part of it is really, it's not experiential, it's not visceral at all. So you can do little things to improve that by making more meaningful captions or making more meaningful stories, but ultimately it's just kind of this disconnected experience. And so it's kind of that, I mean, does that make sense to everybody, hopefully? Like that whole 3-part process and like why you do it, because you want to connect people to the experience they initially followed along with. What we found too is by promoting the article on social media, it was like one of Surfer Magazine's best-selling articles they've ever done, ever. Their best-selling magazine, because there was so much buzz and hype, right?
Yeah.
So there's a massive benefit to us doing that,
yeah.
Or for a brand or for a show or whatever it is. You know, it's really a cool thing, you know, too. And I think, like, to me, it's a matter of figuring out how does it fit into the grand scheme of things. If you know, just the print magazine was your only whole shebang, that's it. Like, it kind of is lackluster.
Yeah,
and if like just the film tour, it's like, I have a feeling this experience wouldn't be as successful if it wasn't carried through everything else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you're seeing it too with what you guys did with the Pharaohs. I mean, you're very much seeing the photos on Instagram, and then some of the photos have showed up in some of the magazines, and then now you have this film tour. And I mean, it was great. Some of you guys were here last night, and it was great. Like, we had people, like I said before, down the sidewalk, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is great. We promoted it a week ago, and here are these people showing up to see you, to see the slideshow, to see the film.
Yeah, and it's ultimately like you can. It's great on social. You can reach, like, you know, millions and millions of people, and then the magazine can reach hundreds of thousands of people, and then you do an event like this, and it maybe only reaches like 300 people. But those, to me, like, that engagement is like 100 times more valuable than any of the other things that you'll do, and that's like where it's really cool, because those people are probably the most willing to actually go to those places and inspire, you know, their own creative change by, you know, experiencing it. That's like really meaningful to me.
Absolutely.
You know, I think it's just a matter of like reevaluating with brands how they interact with ambassadors, and I think with creatives, ambassadors, athletes, whatever you are or whatever you hope to be in that creative space, thinking about like that process and how you can ultimately bring that about. And it might force you out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not comfortable speaking, and maybe you're not comfortable being in the public, and maybe you're not comfortable being that, but ultimately, like, that's okay. You don't have to do that. You can still promote and inspire an event. You don't have to be up in front, like, you know, talking about it as well. It's just a matter of like you putting yourself and asserting kind of your creativity into that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take another question from Twitter. Explore with Max. How has Instagram changed the way you approach photography and building a community / telling a story?
Instagram changed the way I approach photography and building a community. I think what I was just talking about really was answers the second part, which is building a community, telling a story. It's that process, right? Instagram kind of, to me, like, if this has always been the goal, what we're doing right now, this last kind of storytelling thing, Instagram has only helped promote that and make that more available for people, because nowadays, through not only Instagram, but like social media. Like right now we're streaming this live to who knows how many people, but it's rad. People can experience that at their workstations or this and that. Like to me, that's so cool to be able to do that. As far as how it's changed the way I approach photography, it hasn't really changed the way I approach photography. What it has done, let me rephrase that. I haven't changed the way I shoot, framing wise and composition wise because of Instagram, yet it has validated certain things I love to shoot because of the reciprocation I've received on that channel. Yeah. So I've been more psyched to go out and shoot other things that I know people really respond to. As where before I was like, oh man, like you're just, I'm just like a surf photographer, this and that. I've been called that for like, years and years. Like over the last 5 years, I've done 90% of my assignments are completely unsurf related. I just spent 2 to 3 weeks shooting heli skiing in BC, and then I shoot kayaking a lot throughout the year. Like I've had like 3 or 4 covers of canoe and kayak. I shoot a lot of these multitude of sports, and at first I didn't really think that was possible. Right. I'm not saying that to brag at all. It's just like I've been really grateful for what that platform has shown me, and what it is. It's about understanding your analytics and reading people's responses and how that engages with your work, and ultimately letting it change your work if you want it to. I don't think that Instagram should ever change the way you shoot necessarily for the platform. Yet, because me, it's like it's ingrained in me. I'm shooting for a cover or a spread, cover. It's always the same way. Like you're leaving room for a gut, or you're putting, the subject on the right and the, landscape on the left, so you have like space, or you're shooting a photo that can be cropped vertically. Like that's just the way I think. Yeah. But there's one thing I definitely learned in interning for the magazine was it's always better to shoot more pulled back than it is tighter, because you can always crop in, especially with digital cameras. You can't always create more space.
Absolutely. So were you a fan of what Instagram going from square to portrait?
Yeah. I've always been. I know some of the folks over there at the platform, some like community people. They're really awesome folks, and one of the things I learned pretty early on is they always liked it when people use their full real estate, the full square. And so I was always a fan of the full square, and I'm really grateful now that they've changed the layout so that you can appreciate a more wide perspective, because it's always a frustrating thing, like when you look at somebody's feed, and like it's really nice, it's all about curation, right? Yeah. So if it looks curated really well, like all the images are kind of this ebb and flow of colors and subject matter and all of these things, then it really, I feel like it comes to life a lot more, Totally. Than just like all these photos, these white borders and sandwiched in there. It's like hard to read. And this might be really, really stupid, and I'm sorry, I'm just kind of exampling on my phone, but if you like look at somebody's feed and you can like squint your eyes and you can kind of like, you can still make out what every photo is. Oh, yeah. Okay. If you can still make out what every photo is, usually that means they've done a good job of their composition is such that it's not too busy, and it's very it's very easy to read, easy to navigate. Yeah. You find that those photos tend to do better than if it's something that's like really complex and busy. And it's just like the platform is such that it lends itself more to photos like that. Yeah. You have a really small space. You can't be hunting and searching for this and that. It's about trying to create a 3-dimensional image out of a flat screen.
Totally. So you definitely inspire a lot of people out there on the social medias and in person. Are there any photographers or people that inspire you? That's from
I saw that. It's a good question. There's a ton. Oh my gosh, and I'm really bad with like names. Alex Stroll's a really big inspiration to me. He's a good friend. I've worked with him a little bit. I've been able to meet a lot of amazing people on that platform. There's always a lot of people who shoot more like really landscape focused stuff. Keith Lazinski is a super big inspiration to me. Some of the a lot of the Nat Geo guys that are friends of mine and people like that, but it's kind of hard to like just start listing people off, because I feel like if I go down this road, I'm going to forget somebody and I'm going to be super bummed. But honestly, like maybe that's a question I should like post on the site or something like that, a list of people that really inspire me. What I find is definitely, I've always sought out inspiration outside of the main things I shoot. And so it's really cool, especially when I was even shooting surfing a lot, like I didn't really care about reading surf magazines or following surfers or doing this, like, because that wasn't what I wanted to do. If I wanted to shoot and do all the things they were doing, then that was what I would focus on. But I found a lot of inspiration in architecture, in art, in landscape work, in aerial photography, in all of these things, because I love that shift in perspective. Like, how can you apply beautiful architecture of like amazing modern homes in a really wooded setting, clean lines, what is that artist seeing that I'm not? How can I apply something like that to my body of work, And I love like a good car photographer who, like Sinway Xavier, he shoots a lot of these amazing vehicles in these really remote desert settings, and it's like that. I love his work. It's so different than mine, but it's storytelling. It's like it makes you yearn for adventure, and what elements of what he's shooting makes you feel that way. It's the vehicle, it's the setting, it's the amount of landscape versus the amount of product in the shot. It's simple things like that I think have really helped me consider to think of that. So
that's cool. I love that you're looking at stuff that's not necessarly like, cold weather surfing.
Yeah.
In Flagship, folks, do you guys have any questions for Chris?
And
what was the first real experience that drove you to
Taylor. Sorry, I have to give a shout out to Taylor Burke. He just asked me if I want to grab some Chipotle. I love Taylor. He's like one of my good friends. The guy's you're so funny. He's super big inspiration to me. Him, all those Canadian guys, him and Cal Snape, and those guys are really amazing photographers. You're funny. You got me. Sorry. Question. Yeah.
What was the first thing that really inspired you to go to Iceland? Because now you're inspiring so many others to go there.
I went there, and I think the first time I went there was like 2005, something like that. So it's so funny. That seems like it wasn't that long ago, but it was actually like over 10 years ago. So 2005, 2006. What first inspired me? Actually, it was one of the first cold water trips I think I ever did, and I was just really blown away at like people had gone there before me to go shoot surfing, and I was really blown away by the landscapes and the backdrops, and just the fact that you could have such an amazing juxtaposition of like, and that's the thing, is like people had shot landscapes there for years. It was well known, it wasn't really well traveled at that point, but I was just always looking for that contrast of subjects, meaning like, you could have perfect waves in such a harsh and rugged setting. That's really amazing. Like, that's a place that I want to go and create a body of work. And I think that I went there the first time and I was like smitten. I was like, dude, I'm for sure coming back. And I don't know why, but I've just been drawn back. It's been like the craziest, trips over and over and over. I've produced Super Bowl commercials there. I've shot, and directed TV spots. I've done films there. I went there with Justin Bieber. Like, I don't know what to tell you, but it was, for some reason, I keep getting drawn back to that location, and I love it. It's just and I feel like there's so much to find. And because it's so new, because the island is constantly changing and evolving, there's a special type of energy there that you feel when you're shooting. You feel like you're a part of that shifting landscape. And not to get all like ethereal and weird with you guys, but I do feel like it's a very unique location for a photographer and for a creative. So, but the thing is, there's so many like that. Kamchatka, Russia is equally as stunning and equally as unique, and probably, if not more wild and remote. And that trip that we did to there was insane as well. So I feel like there's a lot of Icelands out there. It's just a matter of like, that's the easiest and best promoted place to go, to have a great adventure in a quick amount of time. But there are so many islands like that in the world, that are just begging for us to go and explore, And I think for me in my work, I look for places where the mountains meet the sea. Like, if I could sum it up into one simple thing, I look for that juxtaposition, where you have this rough ocean that meets these jagged peaks. Like, that is what I yearn to shoot. Places like Patagonia, places like, Alaska, like those are the locations that I've been drawn to. You don't find that in Central America. You don't find that by the equator. Things tend to flatten out as they get by the equator. And so I think that's, for me, why I haven't been drawn to warm places as much. So, yeah. Yes. So
Can you repeat the question real quick for
Oh, yeah.
Online?
The process of me writing and getting the children's book published. So I have always wanted to do a children's book, but I'd never really thought it was something possible to do. I had done like 4 or 5 books since then, and you kind of like get into this project. You know what works. You know how books work. You're like, great, cool, all I have to do is gather these photos and gather some stories. So that doing a children's book was a totally reevaluation of that entire process, because I couldn't just rely on the photographs to tell the stories. I had to actually come up with the story and build supporting elements around it, because children, you have to be to the point, but you have to also like really distill down what it is that's important for them to know, and support that with things that really make sense. So there's a publisher, Dreamling Books, out of Salt Lake City, and they reached out to me asking if I wanted to do one. And basically, we came up with the story. We wrote the story. I kind of wrote it. I told them what I wanted it to be, and they helped me like kind of formulate it. And then what I did is we took my images and we went to an illustrator, a Disney illustrator named Dave McClellan, super talented guy, and he works with the Disney digital team, and he illustrated these kind of 7 landscapes that I love, or 6 places like mountains, forests, beaches, whatever. And we kind of created those visions for the book, and that was really how that came about. And then ultimately, like I said, I've done books with big publishers. I've self-published. I've done the whole process. For this book, we wanted it on purpose to be a community-funded project, because if the community feels like they're a part of it, then they will take partial ownership of it. So it was kind of a marketing thing that we did on Kickstarter. And that was the whole purpose. We wanted it to be that process. And ultimately, we promoted it. It got funded in like 2 days, had amazing funding, totally was an eye-opening experience to me. And the message was such that, yeah, it applies to children, but if you've ever read a Shel Silverstein book, you know that it applies to adults just as much, maybe more as you get older. So that was kind of the goal, was to create something that could apply to both generations. And I've wanted to do more, since then. I have 2 boys, and so it was a really inspiring thing to have something for them. And I don't know, it almost makes me emotional talking about it, because it was such a, similar to, I guess, my TED Talk. I think it was one of those like career things that I will always look back on and be grateful for, because what it forced me to do is kind of, you get to these points in your career where you feel like you've kind of figured things out. Like, oh, I know the recipe for this. I know how to do this, and this is all great. And like, I could go and do, an article on here. But what's nice is when you have these moments where everything stops and you're forced to like reevaluate everything you're doing and like think of it in a new way. And that's kind of what the children's book forced me to do. And that was really refreshing for myself, to kind of stop and simplify. Places I really wanted to go to is Russia. And I've been there twice, but the first trip I went there, we were so excited. We did all our planning, and we really just tried to like figure out everything we could, but we were kind of coming up on this like window of time we had to go, and so we had to go. We like booked our tickets, did this and that. We got like logistics on the ground, figured out like who's going to help translate for us, who's going to help like drive us around. And we went there, and I wasn't in the country more than like 10, 15 minutes, and I was being interrogated because I had the wrong entry date on my visa. My visa to enter the country. It was everybody else got to go in, the whole crew of like 6 people, but not me. And so I got put in a jail cell for 24 hours. And then, we were on the phone to the U.S. Embassy trying to get out. And my wife, was helping me out, and we were trying to just get me fed and all these things. And then, man, it was a gnarly experience. And at the end, I got deported to Korea, and I came home. What I realized from that experience, because I was kind of like, oh, cool, I've been to Iceland, I'd been to, Haida Gwaii, I'd been to Canada, I'd been to like some of these colder places. Like I was really eager to like start doing this, like start going to these more remote locations. I realized that if you compromise the process, it doesn't really matter how you end up, you will ruin the experience. And so for me, it was like, I realized that I had to slow down, reevaluate what I wanted to do, what my goal was, and not just try to like force my way through things. And this is why Ben and I, a lot of these trips, they take a couple years to plan, years in advance. Like we've talked about stuff for I don't know how long, and then ultimately it'll come to fruition, and we have a really good success rate of going there and getting what we need to get and planning it during the right weather windows and having the right logistics, because we're not just trying to force something through. We're actually slowing down and doing that. And so I had to learn the hard way, the really hard way. It was super scary, and it was also one of those things where I realized, I think being like 21, that I wasn't this invincible 21-year-old, when you have all your rights stripped away from you in a country that, you can't understand the customs, the language, anything, it's really a scary experience. And I'm probably making it out to be more joyful than it was, but it was terrifying. And And I definitely learned a lot from that experience.
Wow.
So yeah,
That is quite the process.
it was good. It's a great process. I'm
Oh, man.
super stoked.
I love that story was interesting last night, so I'm
Yeah.
glad you touched on that. So, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here, guys. We're gonna throw this on the MiiR blog. We'll send it to Chris. It'll be on his site as well.
Cool.
If you guys have time to go to Portland, head there now. Shows at 5 or 6 tonight at the Keene headquarters.
6. Yeah, 6 to 9. So we're gonna do the same deal, just some like a slideshow and a film screening and just chat.
And the
answer my questions.
slideshow, no offense, Ben, but the slideshow is almost better than the film. I mean, it's like you guys getting up there and talking. Like, I love that piece of it. You know?
We
like,
both love just talking about the funny anecdotes because the film always leaves out a bit. You know, it's like you can't like address those things as like straight on as you can in the film. You know, everything has to flow, but it's fun. I think that's what we love. Is coming and like sharing.
The film was great, but that slideshow was a real treat for us. I mean, just for you guys to kind of get that backstory was fantastic. So you can follow Chris on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Chris Burkard.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. This is
Yeah.
an amazing chat too.
That's good. All right.
So,
all right. Thank
cheers.
you guys.
Thank you.